I never thought it would come to this. 28 years of raising Evan on my own, of bending my body and soul into the shape of a mother who could be everything, provider, nurturer, protector. And now, on the cusp of the day that was supposed to mark the beginning of his new life, he'd made it painfully clear I wasn't invited to be part of it. The phone call came 2 days before the wedding. I was on the porch of my restoration shop, cradling a cup of weak tea between my palms, watching the late afternoon light stretch itself across the Pacific. The breeze carried that soft tang of salt and eucalyptus, the kind of air that reminded you how small you were. I liked that feeling. Most days I found comfort in being invisible. But that call cut through everything. "Don't come to the ceremony, Mom." That was it. No greeting, no preamble, just the sentence, sharp and cold, like wind off a blade. I waited, hoping maybe it was a joke, that he'd follow it with a nervous laugh, or some clumsy explanation about venue limits or awkward family politics. But what came next was worse. "You'll ruin it. You always make things uncomfortable. And Clara doesn't want any drama. This is a new chapter. We want a clean start." Clean start. Like I was dirt that needed to be scrubbed away. I don't remember what I said in return. Maybe nothing. Maybe just the hollow sound of my breath catching in my throat. My hand tightened around the phone, the ceramic of the mug shifting dangerously in my lap. I could still hear the waves, slow and distant, like a lullaby from a life that didn't belong to me anymore. "I'm sorry if that's harsh," he added, though there was no apology in his tone. "But I need you to respect this. Please, just don't show up." Then the line went dead. No goodbye, no hesitation, just silence. For a long time, I sat there without moving. The tea had gone cold, and my legs had begun to ache from staying in the same position too long. But I couldn't bring myself to shift. If I moved, it would mean acknowledging that the call had happened, that Evan, my son, my only child, had cast me out of his life like a moth-bitten coat, no longer fit for public wear. I looked down at my hands, the veins that ran across them like dry riverbeds, the worn skin, the scars from paper cuts and splinters of aged wood. These hands had held him as a baby, stitched torn shirts, packed lunches, paid bills, buried a husband, built a life from the dust of grief. But to Evan, they had become hands of the past. Hands that didn't belong in his future. Maybe I should have seen it coming. Evan had been growing colder with me over the years. Subtle, at first. The clipped responses, the way he stopped calling, unless he needed something. The way he avoided looking too long at my small shop tucked between the glassy cafes and influencer boutiques of Santa Monica. The way he started dressing like a startup executive even when he was just running errands. Clara didn't help. From the first time I met her, I knew she had that smile that never quite reached her eyes, the kind that evaluated you as she listened. Pretty, polished, perfect, but hollow in the ways that mattered. She'd taken one look at my shop and said, "This is quaint," like it was a dog-eared book in a sleek modern library. Evan had changed after her. Or maybe he had already been changing, and I just didn't want to see it. Maybe Clara didn't steer him away from me. Maybe she just gave him permission to stop pretending. Still, I never thought he'd say the words out loud. I tried not to cry, but the ache wasn't in my eyes. It was deeper than that, somewhere beneath the breastbone, where the hurt gathered like wet fabric. I pressed a hand to my chest and tried to breathe past it. I'd spent so long trying to keep everything quiet, dignified, bearable. When Martin died, Evan was still a boy, and I told myself I had to be the one to hold everything together. I took over the shop full-time, learned how to handle clients, ink, old vellum, fragile pigments. I worked with my hands and kept my grief folded small like one of the letters I restored. I didn't date, didn't travel, didn't complain. I stayed steady, thinking that if I gave Evan a life free of chaos, he would grow up knowing he was safe, loved. But maybe love wasn't what he wanted. Maybe safety became suffocation in his eyes. I looked at the closed sign in the shop window, faintly visible through the glass door behind me. The gold lettering had begun to peel at the corners. Another thing I'd been meaning to fix and never got around to. The whole place had that kind of worn familiarity, like a sweater you couldn't bear to throw away even though the sleeves had frayed. To me, it was a sanctuary. To Evan, it was something to escape from. I stood, slowly, and walked back inside, The scent of aging paper and linseed oil hit me like a memory. The shelves, the unfinished projects, the small desk lamp still lit over the manuscript I'd been restoring, a 19th century journal from a Spanish sailor full of ink blots and heartache. I touched the edge of the desk, grounding myself. The wedding would go on without me. There would be laughter, champagne, perfectly staged photos, and no sign of the woman who raised the groom, just as they wanted. And maybe that was fine. But I wasn't sure I could keep pretending anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the overhead light dimmed low, just enough to see the grain of the old wood beneath my fingers. I'd sanded and stained that table myself 20 years ago. Martin used to say I had the patience of a saint when it came to bringing dead things back to life. But what good was that now, when my own son no longer saw me as someone worth remembering? Evan had been my whole world once. He was 5 when Martin died. I remember the way he clung to my leg at the funeral, his little suit too tight, his shoes scuffed from kicking gravel outside the church. I'd held it together until after the last condolence was whispered, until the last casserole dish had been covered with foil, and then once the house was empty and quiet, I sat on the bathroom floor and sobbed like a wounded animal. But never in front of him. I made that promise to myself. I would be his strength. I turned the shop into my livelihood. What had once been Martin's side hobby, restoring old letters, antique maps, and rare books, became the family business. I started small, a few private collectors, the occasional museum project, fragile family Bibles with missing pages and brittle spines. I took pride in the work. There was something almost sacred about it, to hold a piece of someone's history, to mend what time had tried to erase. It gave me purpose, and Evan had always been close by. He'd do his homework at the counter while I cleaned ink off parchment. He used to fall asleep to the smell of paper glue and dust. We were a team, I thought. A quiet, scrappy, loyal little team. But I should have known that children grow differently when grief is the soil they're planted in. Evan was a bright boy, curious and sensitive. He asked questions constantly about everything. Why ink faded, how ships navigated with stars, what made glue sticky. But as he got older, his curiosity turned outward, toward things I didn't understand. Computers, stocks, cryptocurrency. I remember walking in one afternoon to find him watching videos on some site about investing. He was 15. "Shouldn't you be doing your math homework?" I asked. "This is math," he'd said without looking up. "Just smarter." I didn't press him then. I didn't want to dim that spark. But I watched something shift after that. He stopped sitting with me in the shop, started locking his bedroom door. He wanted sleek, fast, efficient. My slow, analog world began to bore him. I became quaint, then irrelevant. The first time I felt that real distance was his senior year of high school. He'd gotten into a prestigious university, the kind with sandstone buildings and wine and cheese alumni mixers. I was thrilled for him. Terrified, too. I'd saved what I could, scraped together tuition with help from a modest insurance payout. But I couldn't give him the lifestyle some of his classmates had. When I visited him for Parents' Weekend, he met me outside the dorm with a look I couldn't quite name. It wasn't embarrassment, not openly, but it wasn't warmth either. "Did you have to bring the cardigan?" he'd muttered as we walked through campus. "You look like someone's librarian." "I am someone's librarian," I joked, hoping to soften it. He didn't laugh. That weekend, he introduced me to a few classmates. Polite boys in loafers, girls in expensive boots. They all nodded, smiled tight-lipped. Nobody asked what I did. Evan never brought it up. He didn't come home that summer. He said he'd gotten an internship at a tech firm. Good money, good connections. I told him I was proud. I was proud, but the ache of his absence hollowed me out. It wasn't just that he didn't visit, it was how quickly he stopped calling. Our conversations shrank to clipped updates. His tone became sharp, impatient, like I was a customer holding up a line. He started talking more about Clara, the girl from one of his classes, studying marketing, working part-time at a boutique branding agency. "She's a real power player," he'd said once. "Thinks big." I remember thinking, and I never did? The first time I met her, Clara wore heels, too high for our creaky shop floor, and carried a bag that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She looked around the room with a kind of practiced smile, the way realtors look at homes they already know won't sell. How charming, she said. It's like stepping into a storybook. That was the moment I knew I was never going to be enough for her, for Evan, for this polished, fast-paced world they were carving together. I was the chapter before the real story began, and I was being edited out. I tried to remind myself that this was what mothers were supposed to do, raise children who outgrow you, who find their own paths. But I never expected the path to be paved so far from where we started. I lit a candle that night, something I do when my thoughts get too loud. The flame danced quietly on the table, flickering against the old brass lantern Martin had found at a flea market the year before Evan was born. I watched it until my eyes began to blur. Then I carried myself to bed, stiff and slow, like someone made of wood. I lay down fully clothed, the weight of my sweater oddly comforting against the sheets. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. I thought of Evan as a child, his small feet pattering across the hallway, the way he used to whisper, "Mom," in the middle of the night, just to make sure I was still there. I had been there. Always. Even when he stopped looking for me. The first time Clara stepped into my home, I knew exactly who she was. She didn't need to say much. Her eyes did the work for her. They scanned the living room like an appraiser, taking silent inventory of every object, every corner, every worn edge. The bookshelf, with mismatched volumes, the lace curtains slightly yellowed from sun, the chipped vase on the windowsill holding dried lavender. She smiled, tight and practiced. "It's cozy," she said, pausing just long enough on that word to make it sound like an apology. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, wiping my hands on a cloth, pretending not to notice. "It's home," I said. She offered a polite nod and sat down on the edge of the couch, as if the cushions might swallow her whole. Evan followed her in, with that distracted look he'd adopted lately, already halfway into his phone. He didn't notice the look I gave her. He never did. They were visiting for dinner, a last-minute suggestion from Evan. "We'll stop by after the conference," he'd said. "Clara wants to see the place." But she didn't want to see it. She wanted to confirm what she already believed, that Evan's mother was a relic of a world she didn't admire and couldn't benefit from. I made roast chicken, carrots with honey and thyme, and my grandmother's cornbread, food that meant something. Clara barely touched her plate. She was on her phone for half the meal. When I asked her about her work, she talked about brand alignment and leveraging influence, terms that felt like neon signs in a sepia room. When I turned the conversation to something smaller, something more human, she blinked at me like I'd spoken a language she didn't know. "Have you ever worked with your hands?" I asked her. "Something like ceramics, wood, even gardening?" She gave a little laugh, not cruel but not kind either. "I tried making a wreath once," she said. "From one of those Pinterest tutorials. I gave up halfway through." I smiled politely, but something in me settled that night like dust on forgotten shelves. Clara wasn't interested in roots. She was interested in optics, and Evan, my Evan, had become fluent in her world. After they left, I washed the dishes slowly, turning the plates in my hands, like artifacts. I thought about the way Evan had leaned into her, how he'd glanced at me when I mentioned childhood stories, almost warning me to stop. I thought of how she didn't once ask me about my shop, my work, my life. That night, I stood in front of the mirror and studied my reflection. Gray hair, thinning at the part, eyes lined with sleepless years. A cardigan that had once belonged to Martin's sister. I looked like someone she'd pity, and for a brief, shameful second, I pitied myself too. But I wasn't sorry for the life I'd built. Everything in my home had a memory. The armchair, by the window. Martin used to sit there with Evan in his lap, reading aloud from old adventure books. The chipped bowl on the mantel. It had survived our first apartment fire when a candle tipped in the bathroom. Even the uneven floorboards in the hallway were worn from late-night pacing when Evan was sick with fever. This wasn't clutter, it was history. Our history. And Clara would never understand that. In the months that followed, Evan began calling less. He'd moved in with her in a high-rise apartment downtown, concrete and glass, minimalism and sleek lines. He didn't invite me over. Once I asked him about it. "When can I see the place?" There was a pause, then "It's not really set up for visitors yet." That was the first time I knew, really knew, that I was being quietly erased. He came by once, alone, to pick up a box of his things. Old books, a few photographs, A model ship he and Martin had built together. He looked different that day. Slimmer, polished, distant. "I don't think Claire's ever seen me without a collar shirt," he joked. I laughed politely. "She seems polished." He nodded, but didn't smile. "She's ambitious. She knows what she wants." "And what do you want?" He didn't answer, just picked up the box and said, "We're thinking of getting engaged." The silence between us stretched long and taut. "That's a big step," I said. "Congratulations." He looked down, as if unsure how to read my tone. "You'll like her more once you know her." I didn't respond. I wasn't sure he wanted me to. Weeks later, I received a card in the mail. A square, cream-colored invitation with gold script. "Clara and Evan. Save the date." There was no personal note, no call, no warmth, just a glossy announcement. When the formal invitation followed, I noticed something odd. My name was listed at the bottom of the page, beneath the groom's father, who had been dead 23 years. It felt like a placeholder, like an obligation checked off. I didn't ask for anything, didn't complain. I bought a dress, a simple navy blue one I could wear again for less painful occasions. I wrapped a gift. I even booked a hair appointment. I was preparing to be present for my son, even if I had to sit in the back, even if no one looked my way. But then the call came, the one on the porch, the one that said, "Don't come." That's when I realized they didn't want me there at all. It wasn't about embarrassment. It wasn't about seating arrangements or logistics. It was about image, Clara's image, Evan's new world. I didn't belong in the curated perfection they were building. I was the ghost of everything they wanted to leave behind. And so I stayed away. There are certain drawers you avoid opening, not because you've forgotten what's inside, but because you haven't. Mine was in the back room of the shop, beneath the workbench I'd had since Martin was alive. It stuck when you pulled it too far and creaked like it remembered pain. The kind of drawer that held 100 unfinished thoughts. Inside were old envelopes, faded receipts, dried-up pens that still felt too heavy to throw away, and beneath it all, tucked flat against the bottom in a plastic sleeve, was the key. I hadn't touched it in years. I don't even remember when I first found it. It was after Martin died. Maybe 6 months. Maybe 9. I was sorting through his boxes in the attic, trying to make sense of what he'd left behind. Not just the obvious things, his flannel shirts, his leather boots, the shaving kit he never replaced, but his paper trail. Martin was a meticulous man, quiet, thoughtful, the kind of person who didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. But he kept things. Pages of notes scribbled in tiny print, printed articles about early tech revolutions, strange little books about digital security, open source movements, blockchain. At the time, I had no idea what any of it meant. I assumed most of it was sentimental or speculative, the sort of things a man with a restless mind would tinker with in his downtime. Then I found the key. It wasn't a regular key, not for a drawer or a locker. It was sleek, metallic, stamped with a tiny logo and a long cryptic string of numbers etched into the side. I nearly threw it out, but something in my gut told me to pause. I held onto it, shoved it in a folder, and slid it into the drawer I rarely opened. I didn't think about it again for years. But now, days after Evan's call, after his rejection, after the hollow quiet that followed, I felt something shift. Maybe I wanted to be reminded that Martin had once trusted me with things no one else knew. Or maybe I needed to know that some secrets didn't hurt, they protected. I opened the drawer with both hands. The air was dry and smelled faintly of old glue and cedar. I found the sleeve and took out the key. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers along the engraved numbers. I sat at my desk, pulled out my laptop, and typed them in. I hadn't done this before. I didn't even know if the wallet still existed. Maybe it had been drained. Maybe it was all just a fantasy, Martin's quiet rebellion against the known world. But when I entered the passphrase and pressed unlock, the screen blinked, and then it was there. A balance. Numbers so large. They didn't make sense at first. I thought it was an error. I refreshed the page, checked the digits again. But it was real. Martin had bought Bitcoin. Years before anyone we knew even knew how to pronounce it. Before people were talking about it at dinner parties. Before it became a headline. He'd bought it, stored it, and never spent a cent. And now it had grown into something unimaginable. Millions. I sat back in my chair, stunned. Not joyful, not frightened. just hollow. Like someone had pulled a curtain and shown me a stage I didn't know I was standing on. Martin had left me something extraordinary. Not just wealth, but foresight, protection, a parachute I never even knew was there. And I hadn't told Evan. Not because I wanted to punish him. Not because I didn't trust him, but because somewhere deep down, I knew he wasn't ready. Not for something like this. It wasn't just money. It was legacy. The truth was, I hadn't thought about using it. The shop had kept me afloat, even in lean years. I had everything I needed. A small life. A full one. I didn't want more. But now that I'd seen the numbers, now that the possibility of change was no longer theoretical, I felt something new stir in me. Not greed. Not revenge. Curiosity. What could this become, if I chose to use it? What would it mean to finally live for myself, instead of guarding what remained of everyone else? I closed the laptop slowly, placed the key back in its sleeve, and tucked it in a different drawer this time. One closer to my reach. I didn't make any decisions that night. Didn't suddenly buy a plane ticket or call a financial advisor. I just sat there, staring at the quiet space around me. The shop. The yellow lamp. The manuscript half restored on the desk. The ticking of the old clock in the hallway. The life I built had always been about preservation, saving things worth keeping. But maybe it was time to start building something new. I didn't open the key drawer again for 3 weeks. I told myself I was busy. There were pages to mend. A French botanical sketchbook from the late 1800s to restore, a local historian's diary to rebind. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid of what that kind of money would do, afraid of how easily it might warp the life I'd carved out from grief and threadbare years. But more than that, I was afraid of what it would mean to step out of the life Martin and I had built together and into something new, something that didn't have his fingerprints on it. I spent more time than usual thinking about him that month. Martin had never been loud. He was the kind of man who waited for the silence between others' words before speaking. He had a voice like warm flannel and hands that always smelled faintly of linseed and metal. He made furniture when we were first married, rough and sturdy pieces that filled our first apartment, then our second, and finally this place. I still eat breakfast every morning at a table he built from reclaimed oak. He wasn't ambitious in the way Evan is. He didn't chase things. He didn't want a bigger house or a better title. What he wanted was presence, to live in a way that mattered to the people he loved. We met at a library. I was working the reference desk. He came in looking for a book on early European cartography, and I teased him for choosing such a dry subject. He smiled and said, "Dry? No, it's just full of places waiting to be found." I laughed. I hadn't laughed like that in weeks. He kept coming back. Always something to ask about. Ink formulas, old bookbinding techniques, forgotten languages. I didn't realize he was courting me until he brought me a pressed flower between the pages of a borrowed novel. "You forgot to check page 243, he said. I married him 9 months later. We didn't have much, just a shared apartment above a bakery, and dreams we never said aloud. He set up a workbench by the window. I built a bookshelf from leftover crates. We were small, but we were solid. When Evan was born, Martin didn't say much. He held him in the hospital room, with tears silently running down his cheeks. Later, when we were alone, he whispered, "Now I really have something to build for." He was a quiet father, but attentive. When Evan was sick, Martin read to him, for hours, legends and maps, and faraway lands. He taught him to hold tools properly, to respect wood and grain, to listen more than speak. And then, one afternoon, he was gone. A blood clot, they said. Instant. He'd been sanding a piece of walnut for a rocking chair he never finished. The house was too quiet after that. Evan was 5. He didn't understand what it meant to lose someone so thoroughly, to have the air changed forever. But I did, and so I became everything Evan needed. I patched up our lives with quiet meals, bedtime stories, schedules. I worked in the shop during the day and taught myself to run the business at night. Evan thrived, smart, gentle, full of questions. I thought that meant I was doing something right. But maybe I didn't give him room to see me as a person. Maybe I made myself so small, so selfless, that he forgot I had a life before him. A love, a heartbreak, a history. When I found the Bitcoin key that night, I understood something I hadn't let myself feel until then. Martin had seen the world changing. He hadn't chased money, but he had quietly, wisely, prepared for a future, not because he wanted extravagance, but because he knew that I, left behind, would need something secure. He'd never said a word about it. Not even a hint. And maybe that's what moved me most. He trusted me. Trusted me to find it. Trusted me to choose what to do with it. Not in grief, not in chaos, but in time. It wasn't just a backup plan. It was a gesture of love. Decades deferred. And I hadn't shared it with Evan. Not yet. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I didn't want the gift to rot in entitlement. Because I needed to be sure it would be valued the way it was meant to be. One evening, I pulled out the key again. Not to check the numbers, but to hold it in my palm. It was cool and smooth, heavier than it looked. I closed my eyes and imagined Martin, in the attic, stashing it away, folding the envelope, placing it in a drawer, maybe even whispering goodbye. I whispered back. I found it, love. I found it, and I'll use it when I'm ready. That night, I dreamed of the three of us. We were walking along the coast, Evan between us, younger, full of joy. Martin was laughing. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the way he looked at me, like I was still the girl at the reference desk, the one who never skipped page 2043 again. I woke up smiling, not in sadness, but in something else. Something like peace. The morning of the wedding came quiet and overcast. The kind of sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to be blue or gray. I sat at the breakfast table, staring into a cold cup of tea, knowing I had nowhere to be. Not really. I hadn't told anyone I wasn't going. I hadn't called a single friend to explain why the dress I bought would never leave the closet. I hadn't even canceled the hair appointment. The only call I'd made was to the florist, asking her to redirect the arrangement I'd ordered. A bouquet of soft white lilies and pale blue forget-me-nots to the local hospice instead. Let someone else have the beauty today. Let someone else feel remembered. Around 10, I got into my car. I didn't have a destination. Not at first. I just drove, through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, past the little bookstore Evan used to beg me to stop at, as a boy, past the field where Martin taught him to fly a kite so large it dragged across the sky like a flag. It was strange how those memories came alive again when I wasn't trying to summon them. They floated to the surface uninvited, like ghosts at a train station. I ended up by the church. It wasn't intentional. At least, that's what I told myself. But when I saw the white ribbons tied to the iron gate and the cars lining the block, luxury SUVs, black sedans, the kind of cars people leased to show they were finally someone, I knew this was where I had meant to be all along. I parked far from the entrance. Not out of shame, but to keep my distance. The ceremony had already begun. I heard the swell of music from inside, some instrumental piece, carefully curated, undoubtedly chosen by Clara, with precision. I stood across the street beneath the shade of a jacaranda tree, watching guests file in through tall wooden doors, women in fitted pastel dresses, men in tailored suits. No one looked over their shoulder. No one noticed the woman in the cardigan standing across the road. I told myself I'd leave in a few minutes, that I just wanted to see him one last time in this role. Groom, man of the hour, darling of a life I no longer had a place in. But then I saw him. Evan. He was standing at the edge of the church doors, straightening his cuffs, nodding at someone. He looked handsome. Yes, but not like himself. His hair was trimmed sharp, his posture rehearsed. He didn't fidget. He didn't scan the crowd for someone he loved. He looked edited. Beside him, Clara appeared in her white dress, radiant and poised. She leaned in, said something close to his ear, and he smiled. But I saw it, the flicker, behind his eyes. That brief moment when his smile didn't quite meet the surface. When something caught in his throat before he swallowed it down. He didn't see me, and I didn't wave. I stayed under that tree, watching from a distance as they disappeared into the church together. The doors shut, muffling the organ, the chatter, the vows that would be exchanged without me there to hear them. It was then I realized this wasn't my grief anymore. It had grown into something different, something quieter, sharper, not sadness, not even rejection. It was the full weight of understanding that I had been written out of the story he was now telling the world. And so, I left. I drove until the city turned to coast, until the asphalt gave way to a bluff overlooking the ocean. I pulled off at a small lookout I used to visit when Evan was a child. Martin and I would bring a blanket, a thermos of coffee, and sit for hours while Evan tossed rocks into the wind. I got out of the car and stood by the railing. The sea below was calm, the sky just beginning to peel back its gray skin, revealing soft blue. A breeze tugged gently at my sleeves. In my pocket was a tissue I'd been holding all morning. Unused. I didn't cry. I didn't want to. There were moments when I thought about driving to the reception, walking in with my head high, reminding them all that Evan had a mother who loved him enough to disappear for his comfort. But I knew what that would turn into. Whispers, polite smiles, an awkward photo where I'd be cropped out before the album was printed. So instead, I stood there until the shadows lengthened, until the sun dipped low and golden on the horizon. I thought about what it meant to step back, to let go, to release someone you raised into a life that no longer made room for you. It hurt, of course it did. But it also clarified something I hadn't wanted to admit before. That love is not proof against erasure. That motherhood, as all-consuming as it is, does not grant you permanence in your child's heart. Especially not when the world he's building is allergic to memory. As the sky turned from gold to indigo, I whispered a quiet wish into the wind. May he never forget who he was before he became who he thinks he has to be. And I turned away. It was nearly midnight when the phone rang. I had just finished washing my face, my cardigan draped over the arm of the chair by the window. The wedding dress hung silently in the closet. Tags, still attached, untouched. The house smelled faintly of lavender soap and wood polish. An old scent that always reminded me of order, of calm. But the moment I heard the tone of the ring, sharp, insistent, I knew it was him. Evan. I stared at the phone on the nightstand for a few seconds before answering. My hands were dry. My mouth dry. Hello? I said, though I already knew. Mom, came his voice, tense, fast, breathless. Where were you? I stood by the window, the curtain in one hand, heart slowly folding inward. Home. You didn't come. We looked for you. I was never supposed to come, I said. You told me not to. He was quiet for a beat. Then, a frustrated breath. That's not what I meant. No? I said, still calm. Because that's exactly what you said. Word for word. That was before, he snapped. Before the ceremony, I thought. He paused, searching for something. I thought maybe you'd still show up. At least the reception. I couldn't help the laugh that slipped from my lips. Not a mocking one, just tired. Hollow. You told me I would embarrass you, that my presence would ruin the day. I was under a lot of stress. Okay? His tone sharpened. You don't know what it's like, trying to juggle everything, planning, pressure, Clara's family, the speeches, the— Don't, I interrupted. Don't turn this into logistics. This wasn't about the flowers or the seating chart. You asked me not to be there, and I listened. He was silent again. And in that pause I felt it. That familiar pull. The guilt, the longing, the unbearable temptation to soothe him. To say, I understand. It's okay. I forgive you, even when I wasn't okay. Even when he hadn't asked for forgiveness. But I didn't. You missed it, he finally muttered. Like a punishment. No, I said. You missed me. The words landed with a quiet finality that filled the room like fog. I could hear the noise behind him, music, laughter, clinking glasses. Someone's voice called out his name, in the background. A celebration still unfolding. You didn't even call before today, I continued. Not to say, you'd changed your mind. Not to invite me back. Not to ask how I was. You didn't want me there, Evan. You just didn't want to deal with what it meant to have me gone. That's not fair. Isn't it? I said, finally sitting down on the edge of the bed. You wanted a clean version of your life, and I'm the stain you couldn't scrub out. His breath caught, and I knew I'd struck something deep, maybe even cruel, but I didn't take it back. I worked so hard to give you everything I could, I said softer now. And not just food or clothes or school. I gave you my time, my silence, my sacrifices. You don't even know what I gave up so you could be the man you are now. I never asked you to, he said coldly. The room spun a little. Those 5 words chipped something off the wall I had spent years carefully rebuilding. You didn't have to ask, I said, holding my voice together. That's what love is. He didn't answer. For a long while, Neither of us spoke. I could hear someone speaking to him again in the background. Clara, maybe. Or one of her polished friends, he responded with a short reply, then returned to me. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said, his voice smaller now. I believe you, I said, but you did. I stood and crossed the room to where the invitation still sat on my dresser. I picked it up and looked at it. The gold letters, the embossed edges, I imagined them smiling in their photos, drinking champagne under twinkling lights, talking about futures they'd mapped out in spreadsheets and vision boards. I hope you're happy, Evan. I really do. There was a strange sound on the other end, a breath, a choke. I miss you, Mom. That did it. I closed my eyes. I miss you too, I whispered. But I don't miss feeling like I don't belong. I don't miss apologizing for who I am. He said nothing. Don't call me just because the pictures are done and you suddenly remember the part of your life you cropped out. Don't call me because Clara's gone to bed and the guilt kicked in. I'm not doing that. Then why are you calling? He faltered. Because I needed to hear your voice. I hope it helps. We sat there, suspended by a phone line, two hearts in different rooms, different worlds, and I realized that what I felt wasn't anger. It wasn't even grief anymore. It was release. I had spent so many years gripping the idea that he'd come around, that he'd see me, value me, love me the way I had loved him. But I was done clinging. Good night, Evan. Mom. I hung up. The silence that followed was not hollow. It was clean. The morning after the call, the shop felt different. It wasn't the light. The sun still poured through the front windows the same way it always did, warming the scuffed floorboards and catching on dust motes suspended in the air like confetti that never fell. It wasn't the air. It still smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and the faint citrus oil I used to clean the work surfaces. No, it was me. Something inside me had gone still. There had always been a kind of sacred quiet in this space. A silence I had cherished. It wasn't emptiness. Not really. It was a reverent sort of hush, like the inside of a library before opening hours. The shop held memory in its bones, and I had always felt at home inside that quiet. But today, the silence felt sharp. Not reverent, hollow. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't want to be alone with it. I busied myself with menial things, dusting shelves that didn't need it, reordering the glue jars, flipping through catalogs of archival paper I couldn't afford, anything to keep my hands moving. My mind wanted to slow down, linger, replay his voice on the phone, rethink my decision to hang up, but I wouldn't let it. I turned to a project I'd left half-finished before the wedding, a family heirloom Bible, spine cracked, gold edging flaking, the kind of restoration job I usually found deeply satisfying. But when I picked up the first section to stitch, my hands hesitated. My needle hovered above the thread like it had forgotten what to do. The truth was, I had lost focus. For decades, this shop had been my anchor, the place where grief softened, where survival became routine. I had loved it not just because it was mine, but because it reminded me who I was without needing to prove anything. No competition, no noise, just quiet care. But now, it reminded me of how long I had been surviving. That's what silence does. Eventually, it reveals everything you've been hiding from. I sat down on the tall stool behind the main desk and let myself look around, really look. The familiar mess of my workbench, the cracked teacup I kept meaning to throw away, the framed photograph of Evan, as a boy tucked behind the receipts and appointment cards. I reached for it, brushing dust from the corner. He couldn't have been more than 8. In the photo, his front teeth missing, one shoe untied, his arms slung around my neck with casual affection. I remembered the day it was taken. We were at a flea market in Venice Beach. Martin had taken the picture on a disposable camera. It was one of the last prints he developed before he died. I held the photo in my lap, stared at that little boy's face, and felt an ache rise in my chest that no amount of tea or time would soothe. Where had he gone? Where had I? Grief, I've learned, is not a one-time storm. It's a tide. It goes out, and you breathe again. You build castles, you plant things in the sand, but it always comes back, sometimes in the middle of a clear day, and drags something away with it. Maybe what it dragged away this time was the illusion that if I just stayed kind and quiet, the world would come back around, that Evan would come back around. I thought of the Bitcoin key, tucked away again, safe in its new drawer. For so long, I'd seen it as something dangerous, something I wasn't ready for, but now it felt like something else. Power. Not the flashy kind, not the kind Evan and Clara valued, but a different kind. The kind that whispered, "You have choices now, real ones." For years, I had lived within limits, financial, emotional, practical. I said no to travel, no to help, no to indulgences, because I had to, because I was a mother first and a person second. But now, Evan had his life. He had his choices. He had made it clear that I was not one of them. And that left me with a question I hadn't dared to ask in a long, long time. What do I want? It was such a simple thing. And yet, I didn't have an answer. So I started small. I wrote it down in my ledger, the same place I tracked supply costs and restoration schedules. A new page, crisp and uncreased. At the top, in all capital letters, what I want. Beneath it, I wrote, a weekend away, somewhere quiet. To eat something I didn't cook. To speak to someone who doesn't expect anything from me. To walk by the ocean without looking at the time. To feel something new. I stared at the list for a long time. Then I turned the page and began planning a short trip. Not forever, not a dramatic exit, just a few days away. Somewhere outside the gravitational pull of this life I'd wrapped around myself like a quilt. The silence of the shop didn't feel so hollow anymore. It felt like an invitation. The phone rang again on a Thursday afternoon. I was restitching a 19th century ledger, one of those heavy leather-bound kinds, with brittle pages that smell like dust and ghosts. My glasses were sliding down my nose, my fingers stained faintly with archival glue, when I heard it, a shrill ring slicing through the stillness of the shop. I knew it was Evan. Before I even looked at the screen, I waited. 3 rings. 4. Then, I picked up. "Hi, Mom," he said. The tone was different this time. Not cold, not angry, but not warm, either. Flat, measured. "Hello, Evan. How've you been?" I gave a non-committal hum and set down my tools. "Busy." A pause. "I've been meaning to call you." I didn't answer. Let him sit with the weight of that sentence. He filled the silence quickly. "Look, I know things have been tense since the wedding." I raised an eyebrow, though he couldn't see it. "You mean the wedding I wasn't supposed to attend?" He exhaled sharply. "Right. That. I didn't handle things well. I admit that." I waited. Apologies from Evan were like eclipses, rare, fleeting, and mostly shadow. "But I'm calling because I need to talk to you about something important." And there it was, the shift, the current under the surface. I could hear it in the way his voice tightened, just slightly, the way the words came quicker now. "My startup, Hexalab, is going through some rough patches." Hexalab. That was the name I'd seen once on a flyer stuck in his old backpack. All sleek fonts and electric blue lines. I hadn't known what they did. I still did. "We hit a snag with funding," he continued. "A couple of investors pulled out, and we're trying to finish development on a key product. It's just a bridge loan, really, short-term liquidity." "Evan," I said slowly, "why are you telling me this?" Another pause. "I need your help." The words hung there, blunt and heavy. He cleared his throat. "I know about the Bitcoin." My heart stopped for a breath. "What did you say?" "I know," he repeated, softer now. "You think I don't pay attention, but I do. I saw the flash drive once. And I remember Dad talking about it years ago, before he passed. He used to say, 'Someday this'll matter.' I didn't understand it back then, but now I do." I stood up from my stool, blood rushing to my ears. My voice came out low, measured. "You went through my things?" "No," he said quickly. "Not exactly. I saw it once. A long time ago, and I put the pieces together." "You've known for years?" "No," he lied. "Not really. I only recently connected it all, but that doesn't matter. The point is, if you still have access to it, if you can help me out just this once, I swear I'll pay you back." I sank into the chair behind the counter, trying to still the shaking in my chest. "You're asking me to give you my savings, my security, my future." "It's not just yours," he said too quickly. "It's part of Dad's legacy. Don't you think he'd want to support what I'm building?" I closed my eyes. That was the cruelest cut of all, invoking Martin. Don't use your father as leverage, I said quietly. Don't you dare. I'm not. You are, I snapped. You are, Evan, and you're not asking. You're assuming, you're presuming I'll say yes, because that's what I've always done. I'm trying to build something, Mom. So, was I said. When I raised you on one salary, when I kept this shop running after your father died, when I patched clothes instead of buying new ones so you could have what you needed, that was my startup, and no one invested in me. He was silent. I'm not angry, I added, more calmly. But I'm not stupid. You didn't call because you miss me. You called because you think I owe you. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. He took a breath, slower this time. Softer. I didn't think it would make you this upset. You didn't think at all, I replied. You didn't think about what it means for a woman like me to hold on to something like that. You didn't ask what I might need. You just saw an asset. He didn't reply. And that was all the answer I needed. I'm not giving it to you, I said. Not now. Not like this. His voice was sharp again, wounded. So you're just gonna sit on millions while I drown? I'm going to protect what I've built, the same way I protected you. And what just let me fail? Maybe failure is what teaches you to value what you ignored, I said. You want something that was never meant to be easy. You want to skip the part where you earn it. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. But the last thing he said was colder than anything I'd heard before. Fine, don't help. But don't expect a seat at the table when it works. I didn't say goodbye. Neither did he. When I hung up, my hands were shaking, not from fear, not from anger, from relief. Because I had finally said no, and I meant it. After Evan's call, the shop went quiet again. Not the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a blanket, but the kind that presses into your lungs, a silence that amplifies every creak of the floor, every breath, every ticking second of the old brass clock by the door. And yet, I didn't cry. I didn't scream or slam the receiver down or pace the floor like I might have done years ago. No, this time, I just sat there, hands folded in my lap. Phone placed face down on the ledger, I stared at the worn grain of the wood countertop and thought, this is what it feels like to choose yourself. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt unfamiliar, because I had spent so much of my life believing that to be a good mother was to be endlessly available. To say yes when you were tired, to give when you had nothing left, to sacrifice because love meant never letting someone drown, even if it meant going under yourself. But that night, I had drawn the line, and something deep in me, something long buried under years of service and soft-spoken forgiveness, had exhaled. In the days that followed, I found myself moving slower, not because I was depressed or unsure, but because I was paying attention in a way I hadn't in years. I woke up with the sun and let the light reach me before the noise of the world did. I made coffee and drank it slowly, standing barefoot in the kitchen, listening to the kettle click as it cooled. I stopped checking my phone. I stopped waiting for Evan to call again. And then, quietly, I began to plan. Not for him, for me. I pulled out the page I had written in my ledger, the one titled What I Want, and added to it. Hire help for the shop. Take one train ride with no destination. Try saffron, real saffron, not the supermarket kind. Look at something famous, in person. Buy a new chair. One just for reading. The next day, I posted a small notice on the shop door. Help wanted, part-time, flexible hours. Patience required, curiosity rewarded. I wasn't expecting much. Restoration isn't the kind of work young people leap toward. It's tedious, precise, slow, but 2 days later, she walked in. Lily, 23, maybe. Long brown hair pulled into a messy knot, big glasses, chipped blue nail polish. She smelled like sandalwood and strawberries, and she looked at the shelves like they were windows into another world. I don't know anything about this, she said, running a finger along the edge of a faded French manuscript, but I want to learn. And that was enough. She started the following Monday. At first, I gave her simple tasks, organizing tools, flattening pages, cataloging past projects, but she was quick, attentive. And more than that, she asked questions I hadn't heard in years. What kind of thread do you use for this binding? Why would someone write on a map in ink that fades? How do you know what's worth saving? That last question nearly undid me. I didn't answer her right away. I just looked around the shop, the dust, the parchment, the little brass weights on my scale, and thought, isn't that the question we all carry? I showed her how to mend a tear in vellum without scarring the page. I let her sit at my bench, use my best scissors. I trusted her. And something about that act, giving someone a piece of my work, of my purpose, felt healing in a way I hadn't expected. I didn't tell her about Evan. I didn't mention the Bitcoin or the wedding or the way a mother's heart can break without making a sound. I just let her be here, in this quiet place, and that was enough. Meanwhile, I began planning my trip. Just a weekend. Nothing dramatic. A small lake town a few hours north, by train, a bed and breakfast with crocheted curtains, and old furniture. The kind of place where time moves differently. I booked the ticket, and when I hit confirm, I felt something bloom in my chest. Not joy, permission. For so long, I had treated happiness like a reward you had to earn by proving your usefulness, by being needed. But no one needed me anymore, not like they used to. And maybe that was the gift. I had a savings account. I had the shop. I had the key tucked away with numbers in it that could change everything. But more than any of that, I had this moment. I stood in the doorway of the shop, late one afternoon, watching Lily gently turn the pages of a travel diary we were restoring. She was murmuring to herself, lips moving in quiet awe. And I realized something. Legacy isn't about inheritance. It's about what you pass on when you stop trying to be everything. I wasn't Evan's foundation anymore, but I could be mine. The day I told Evan I was done, there were no fireworks, no shouting, no accusations, no final collapse into tears. Just my voice, steady and low, and his silence on the other end of the line. He'd called again. Not to apologize, not really, but to explain. He said he understood why I was hurt, but that I didn't understand what he was up against, that he was trying to build something, and everything felt like it was slipping out of his hands. I thought you'd be proud of me, he said. I used to be, I replied, without bitterness. It stopped him for a moment. I could almost hear the gears shift in his head. I still want you in my life, Mom. I need space to build my future. You never adapted. You're stuck in the past. And that's a problem for you? It's hard to explain, he said. No, I answered. It's not. You're embarrassed by me. He didn't argue. I think that was the moment. Something clicked into place. A final puzzle piece I had been turning over in my mind for years. Not quite able to fit. The distance. The clipped calls. The way Clara looked at me like I was something quaint and breakable. It wasn't just that Evan had outgrown me. It was that he didn't want to admit he came from me at all. And that, more than any rejection, was the real grief. I'm not angry, I told him, but I can't keep walking towards someone who keeps stepping back. Then what do? We stop pretending. I said. I meant it. For the first time in years, I wasn't softening the truth to protect his feelings. I wasn't bending myself in half to hold the door open for someone who had already walked away. You'll always be my son, I added, but I'm done proving I deserve a place in your life. He didn't say much after that. A quiet, okay, a breath. Then the line went dead. I set the phone down and walked outside. It was early evening, and the sky had just begun to turn lavender. That soft in-between light where everything feels gentle and weightless. I stood in the middle of my small garden, breathing in the scent of soil and rosemary, and let the silence settle around me. Not as absence, but as clarity. It wasn't peace. Not yet. But it was a kind of beginning. Later that night, I took the Bitcoin key out again. I didn't check the wallet. I didn't need to. I just held it in my palm and whispered, "Thank you, Martin." Not for the money, but for the foresight. For believing in a future I hadn't been ready to claim until now. And then I made a decision. I would use it, not to build a new version of the life I had already lived, but to begin something entirely different. I started small. I donated to the local historical society, anonymously, sent a check to the library where Martin and I met, with a note, for the preservation room, in memory of someone who never stopped asking questions. And I booked another trip. Spain. Not the beach resorts. I wasn't looking for daiquiris and loud music. I wanted to walk the Camino de Santiago, like the woman from the travel journal I restored years ago. I wanted to feel the ground under my feet, to be anonymous, to move through the world without anyone expecting anything from me. I didn't tell Evan. I didn't post about it. I packed my bags slowly, deliberately. 2 pairs of pants, 3 shirts, a light jacket, a notebook, and the smallest copy of Pride and Prejudice I owned. When I locked the door to the shop that evening, I stood there for a long time, not to mourn, to honor. The version of myself I had carried for so long, the widow, the mother, the restorer, the one who waited for calls and apologized for simply existing, she had earned her rest, and I was ready to meet whoever came next. I landed in Madrid on a Tuesday morning. The sky was overcast, the air cool and dry. There was no one waiting for me, no itinerary crafted by anyone else's needs, just my backpack, my boots, and a folded map with the Camino route marked in blue ink. I didn't speak Spanish fluently, but I knew enough. Enough to get by, enough to be polite, enough to say thank you and please, and I don't need help. And for everything else, there was always a smile. A smile in any language is its own kind of currency. I didn't start the full Camino. My knees wouldn't forgive me, but I picked a short stretch, a manageable piece that passed through small villages and olive groves, where the path was lined with quiet and the air tasted of earth and old sun. The first few hours were the hardest. Not physically, but emotionally. There were no distractions out there. No shop bells ringing, no books to mend, no Lily asking about pigments or paper grain, just me and the steady crunch of gravel beneath my boots. Each step sounded like a question I hadn't answered yet. Who am I without the people I've cared for? What do I become when I am no longer being needed? Somewhere past the 3rd mile, I met a woman named Sylvia. She was in her 50s, walking the Camino alone after her divorce. She carried a small stone in her pocket, a ritual from her village in Ireland. You carry your grief with you, she explained, then leave it behind at the Cruz de Ferro. I liked that. I didn't carry a stone, but I had something heavier inside. We walked together for a while, not saying much, just the occasional shared look, or a comment about the wildflowers lining the trail. The silence between us felt different than the one I'd grown used to. This one didn't demand anything. It didn't judge. At a shaded clearing, we stopped for water. Sylvia pulled out a small wedge of cheese and offered it to me. I handed her half of my fig bar. We chewed in quiet companionship. Do you have children? She asked eventually. 1 son, I said. She nodded, but didn't press. And I didn't explain. That night, I slept in a small hostel, tucked behind a stone church. The beds were simple, wooden frames, thin mattresses, but the air smelled of lavender and candle wax, and my window overlooked a field of poppies. I wrote in my journal, until my fingers cramped, recording everything, the color of the sky, the feeling of dirt under my nails, the strange weightlessness of being unknown. No one here cared what I used to be. No one expected answers. I wasn't Evan's mom or Martin's widow or the lady with the shop. I was just another woman on the trail. And for the first time in decades, that felt enough. In the days that followed, my body adjusted, the blisters hardened, my steps grew stronger. I walked through lemon groves and along stone bridges, through villages with shuttered windows and chickens crossing the path like they owned it. I ate lentils with strangers and drank red wine from chipped mugs and watched the sun set behind tiled rooftops. At one rest stop, an older man played an accordion while his wife sang in a language I didn't recognize. I closed my eyes and let the sound fill me. I thought of Evan, not with anger, not with longing, just with distance. Like a chapter whose last sentence had finally been written. One evening, I arrived at a quiet ridge overlooking the valley. It was late. The light had turned gold and soft, painting the hills in honey. I sat on a stone bench and pulled out the photo I had brought. Evan, age 8, the one with the missing teeth and the lopsided smile. I held it for a long time. I did my best, I whispered. Then I folded it once and placed it beneath a rock on the side of the path. Not because I didn't love him, but because I needed to stop carrying the version of him that no longer existed. We love people into being, sometimes, but we can't love them into staying who we want them to be. That night, I slept better than I had in years. I returned home in early autumn. The air had turned crisp in my absence. The hydrangeas outside the shop were browning at the edges, and the wind carried the scent of chimney smoke from someone's early fire. I stood outside the door for a moment, suitcase in hand, and listened to the silence of my street. It was the same, and I was not. Inside, everything was just as I had left it. The light switches hummed as I flipped them on, the floor groaned in greeting beneath my boots, and a fine layer of dust coated the counter like time had paused while I was away. But I could feel it in my bones. Something had shifted. Lily had left a note on the counter, tucked beneath a mug. It read, "The repairs waited patiently." I didn't touch the 1853 ledger. It looked too delicate. "Welcome home." "Well, yeah." I smiled. She'd even left a few tea bags beside the note, chamomile and peppermint. I made myself a cup, then sat on the stool behind the desk and let the warmth settle into my hands. For the first time in years, my return home didn't feel like a step backward. It wasn't a resumption of the old rhythm. It was a continuation of something I had started out there on the trail, among the lemon groves and strangers' songs. I was no longer living for someone else's milestones. No longer waiting for a call that might never come. That night, I unpacked slowly. I took my time folding the few clothes I'd brought. I placed the new mug I bought from a roadside artisan on my shelf. It was painted with a path of tiny blue footsteps that spiraled around the rim. I liked how imperfect they were. Uneven, human. I left my suitcase by the door. I'd never liked fully unpacking after a trip. It always felt too final, and I had a feeling more travel was in my future. 2 days later, the shop reopened. Lily hugged me when she saw me. She smelled like sawdust and apples, and her enthusiasm was unfiltered. "You look rested," she said. "I feel real," I replied. We fell back into a rhythm. Easier now. She took on more work, asked fewer questions, and left me space to breathe. I trusted her. Not just with the books, but with my story, at least the version I was willing to tell. One afternoon, she asked me what I was going to do with it, meaning the Bitcoin. I didn't answer right away. "It's enough to change everything, isn't it?" she said gently. "Yes," I said. "But everything already has." I wasn't hoarding it out of fear anymore. I wasn't waiting for some emergency to justify using it. I just didn't feel the urgency to prove anything with it. We've been taught that money should make noise, that it should build towers and buy status and leave a mark so loud people can't ignore you. But sometimes, money's greatest value is in what it allows you not to do. I didn't need to buy anyone's love. I didn't need to rescue Evan from the consequences of his choices. I didn't need to impress strangers with things they could scroll past on a screen. I used a small portion of it to renovate the back room of the shop. I had the walls redone, added a long workbench, and converted it into a space for classes. Lily taught the first one, basic book repair, 5 students, 3 young women, 2 retirees. The room was filled with laughter and concentration, and the sound of torn paper being gently reborn. I stood in the doorway and watched them. This was what legacy could be. Quiet, practical, shared. One evening, as I was closing up, I saw a familiar figure across the street. Evan. He hadn't called ahead, hadn't texted, he just stood there, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders hunched against the wind. I didn't rush to open the door, I didn't wave, I watched. He finally crossed. "Hi, Mom," he said. Evan. He looked older, not just in his face, but in the way he carried himself. There was something softer in his eyes, like life had roughed up the edges and smoothed out the arrogance. I was in the area. I waited. I heard about the classes. "That's really cool." I nodded once. I wanted to say, "I'm sorry for the way I spoke to you, for what I asked." I said nothing. He shifted. I didn't understand then what it meant, what it cost. And now I do, he said. Or at least I'm starting to. I didn't invite him in, but I said, "Thank you." That was enough. He nodded, hands still in his pockets. "Maybe we can talk again, another time." "Maybe," I said, and he walked away. I didn't watch him go. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and walked home. My life was mine again, and I didn't owe it to anyone.